To the June 23rd City Council work session. I know that Councilor Ortiz is out of the area today. She's gone, so she won't be here. And the first item up is one that we've been very engaged in and care a lot about, and that is the West Eugene MX update. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll just turn it over to Mike and Tom for them to make the presentation. So.
Thank you.
All yours.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to get this update and some new information, or some more recent information, actually. As you know, this has been a long process. It's a federal process. It requires a lot of input, and LTD has tried to map it out at each step of the way so that there aren't surprises. We have been engaged in the alternatives analysis and draft environmental documentation step of the process, and recently have concluded some analysis based on information from consultants, and that information is actually helpful in our decision-making process. So we're at a point where we can actually start to zero in on some decisions based on that data. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that these decisions need to be based on data from these various analyses. This data is at a point where the LTD board has a meeting scheduled tonight, and we're ready to start actually doing some narrowing down of some of the alternatives that have been out on the table for some time. And so before doing that, we wanted to bring you up to date, hear any input that you have to provide. And I think maybe with that, I'll stop and let Tom talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of this.
Thanks, Mike. So what I'm going to start with, if I can figure this out, I always have this adventure.
We have the same problem. Maybe just press that left key.
Okay.
Try that for a while.
We start with the story of 58.
You can't read any of, but nonetheless.
That's and
It's the idea.
graphic.
It's for impression only.
Yes, it's the graphic impact. And the question is, so we have 58 different alternatives currently on the table for this project. And the question that we asked was, well, how did we get there? And it starts with our need, as we develop any MX corridor, to balance the operational needs we have for MX with the intent to avoid and minimize negative impacts where we can. And an example, a good example of that I like to talk about is one of the alternatives for getting up to 6/7 from our Eugene station is to, and the original alternative that we had come up with was going out on 11th, or I'm sorry, on Lincoln, and coming back on Charnelton. And as we went out to the public and talked about that, people had concerns about running MX on Lincoln. So he said, well, we'll look at both directions on Charnelton, and we'll incorporate that into the design. So that added another alternative. And so we've done similar kinds of things like that to get to this set of 58. This is actually a slide that's out of order for some reason, so I'm going to charge right through it and maybe come back to it. But as we have looked at this 58, we talked to the Federal Transit Administration. They suggested to us that 58 is way too many to take through the process we had, that we were in, but that they had an alternative, and that alternative was to basically conduct an alternatives analysis, prepare an alternatives analysis report, and winnow that set down to something more reasonable to take into the environmental process. And so that's the change in the process that we've made. And to talk about that with the public, since over the last month we've had several meetings, and actually, if I can figure it out here.
Left side, do it. I'm not sure.
I was trying to go backwards, but
Oh, going backwards. Somehow we can.
anyway.
That's my technical.
Previous.
You got to do it again.
You guys are good.
So, this month, we have done several things. We had our MX Steering Committee met on June 1st. The West Eugene Corridor Committee met on June 2nd. We held a West Eugene Design Options Open House, and that's a project we've talked to you about that's focused on the section of alternatives east of Garfield. And we had a technical advisory committee related to that process and a local area committee, folks that live, work in this area that were participating in that process.
So we do tech and LEC.
Yes. And we held an open house on June 9th. We had about 64 people, something like that, attend, providing lots of good comment to us on that. We held another corridor committee meeting on June 15th, and that was to go over the technical, more of the technical analysis, and the summary sheet of that technical analysis, by the way, is at each of your places. And then on the 17th, we met with the Citizen Advisory Committee and went over things with them. So we've done quite a bit of work talking to the public, and again, this is a picture from the open house. And it's been through public input, taking stakeholders on tours, agency input, and then just field work where we've come up with these various design refinements. And so what we're proposing at this point is that 58 is too many. Like I said, we've talked to the Federal Transit Administration, and they've suggested a different approach. Moving to that different approach actually allows us to draw on some of the preliminary analysis that we've done to date, take it to the community, talk about what's the data showing with respect to whether some of these alternatives are still viable. And so again, we're going from a combination of an alternatives analysis and draft environmental impact statement that leads to a selection of an LPA, a locally preferred alternative, to a more sequential process where we conduct that alternatives analysis to winnow things down and then make the locally preferred alternative decision and take that into the environmental process. This has the advantage of that alternatives analysis report becomes more of a local planning document. It's something that has a lot more flexibility on our end to conduct the kind of process that the community wants in terms of leading to that decision on the locally preferred alternative. We're still using the same level of analysis that we would have anyway. It's just that this is a more flexible process, and we're better able to collaborate with the community on some of the findings. So again, as I said, and I had the chance to talk to several of you about this, we have this preliminary information that suggests that some of the alternatives are no longer viable. And I want to go through those with you right now. So we'll talk about the criteria, what the summary evaluation is saying, and then specifically about some alternatives that no longer meet the project's purpose and need. One of the things that we did over the last month is to develop information that would be at various levels, depending on people's interests, so that people could get a sense of what we're trying to do here. Because, again, 58 alternatives to sort through is a lot. So we developed what we call a consumer report summary, which you should have all had in your packet. That's something that we included there. We had the full data summaries, the more detailed sheets. I don't think we included those in the packet. Yes? No, that's and then we had a one-sheet summary. So various ways to present the information. There's the summary sheet that you have to your tables, and again, I'm not going to ask you to read through this, but and then the data tables had all of the detail. This you also have in your packets. These 8 criteria are basically from our purpose and need statement, and so we used these criteria to represent whether an alternative was meeting purpose and need. And let me start with then the terminus options. We looked at the full-length alternative, which goes out to Edcone and also serves the Willow Creek area. And as we looked at that, a couple things came up in our preliminary analysis. The first was that the stormwater runoff impacts protected plant species and BLM wetlands. If you're familiar with that section of West 11th, it's essentially surrounded by wetlands. And we would be required to manage that stormwater runoff, which can be quite expensive, so that it didn't have any impact on the wetlands. And as we looked at our preliminary cost estimates, the high end is at running all the way out to Edcone is about $142 million. We've talked to you before about the revenue we expect to be able to, or the funding we expect to be able to put together. The federal grant tops out at $75 million, and we're asking the state legislature for another $30 million. Again, the $30 million is similar to what the Portland area TriMet asked for. They actually got $210 million or something like that. But we're asking for something proportional, basically to help us build this system. And so that's $105 million. $142 million is more. It's not viable from a cost standpoint. And then as we looked at the ridership that we were getting, west of the Commerce terminus, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the ridership is relatively low. Now, people, as we've gone through this, people have asked, well, so in the future, can we extend MX out that way? And I think we'd be, that would make sense. And as, questions about the development that's going to take place out there starts to resolve, it makes more sense for us to then look at that as an option. But we don't think we're foreclosing any options by eliminating the full-length terminus at this point. There are three termini, three terminus options: the full-length, Commerce, and then Seneca. And Seneca is the shortest. And as we looked at that alternative, it made sense to us to remove that from consideration. It creates transfers for riders west of Seneca, which is an issue because it's such a short line anyway. And then MX would not serve a large part of the developed corridor out to Commerce. There's a lot of ridership we'd leave on the table. So it made sense to us to take both the full-length and Seneca termini off. And what that does, it actually has a multiplier effect because of all the different design options that we have on the table. That actually gets us down to about 15 or so alternatives, including, of course, no build and TSM. But wait, there's more. If I can do this. Okay. We also took the opportunity with this information in hand to look at the viability of a couple of the alternatives west of Garfield. And basically, the first one of those was the Amazon alignment. Again, here the data showed that the potential impacts that there would be potential impacts to endangered plant species. The channel itself is over 50 years old, so it constitutes a historical resource or potential historic resource. There's the area is surrounded by low-income housing and parkland. The Amazon restoration design option would require 8 residential displacements and relocations. And this clearly, as I'm sure you're aware, was the issue or the alternative with highest public concern. And so our recommendation at this point is to drop that alternative. As we looked at 7th place, again, the data there suggests that both the ridership is extremely low relative to the others, and we have a couple maps that kind of graphically show that. And then also, one of the things that we don't have up here, but you can look on your data table, the travel time for 7th place is actually longer than no build. And so I think as we looked at it, we feel we'd be better off. And again, this is LTD staff. As we looked at it, we'd be better off running in mixed traffic on West 11th than going on to 7th place. And so that's our recommendation at this point. I forgot I had some more bullets here. So there's one of the other things that people don't realize is that to do the design we have for 7th Place still requires numerous strips of property to be acquired. And it's not a substitute for property acquisition. And again, as I said, it has the longest travel time. It has a relatively high construction cost relative to the others per mile, and it has the highest operating cost because, again, it is a little bit out of direction relative to the corridor we're trying to serve. So this is the map that I wanted to show you. So this is the map showing ridership. Those circles represent the relative scale of the ridership that we get. This is the 6th, 7th option running on 7th Place, and what I'd point your attention to is the relatively small size of that dot. And let me show you 6th, 7th to 11th then, if I can. There we go. And you can see there's quite a bit of ridership in that same segment of West 11th. And so that's all those things together suggested to us that 7th Place was not viable. One of the things is we've been talking about this, like I said, quite intensively over the past month. One of the concerns that arose, and it came up at our corridor committee meeting, was that the concern about keeping 7th Place on wasn't so much the merits of 7th Place itself, it was the concerns about the viability of operating on West 11th between Garfield and Seneca. And as we looked at that, we realized it's a difficult thing to describe, but we've got basically the process that would happen would be, again, looking at the bookends. The bookends would be the proposed design that we have on the table now for West 11th. And at the other end of that bookend, or the other bookend, I guess, is running in mixed traffic on that stretch of West 11th. And again, as you can see, running in the no build reflects kind of a running in mixed traffic option. The no build is actually quicker running down West 11th than it is going on 7th Place. And so hence our feeling that we'd be better off running in mixed traffic on 11th between Garfield and Seneca. The other part is that there are several options, and in addition to the current design, and this is typical of the process that we've used on the first two corridors, we can go in, and in fact, we're going to be doing that this summer, going in and talking to each of the adjacent property owners and talking about what specific impacts there are and how we might be able to address those through detailed design modifications. And we've got several examples on the first two corridors where we've effectively worked through those issues. And a really good example is right here on East 11th. There's the market there on the south side where they were concerned our original design was going to take the commercial parking that's in front of their business. And through, again, this more detailed design look at things, we went back and we figured out a way to retain that commercial parking so that business had what it was looking for. And we've done that in several instances, and I can get you more information on that today. But the point is that we have a process that really takes, and remember, our designs right now are only at the 8 to 10% level. And it really is important as we go through this into the next steps to get down into those details and figure out where we can modify the design to, again, you recall the scales at the beginning of my presentation, balancing the operational needs for MX with the intent of avoiding and minimizing impacts where we can. And we feel, based on our experience in the first two corridors, we're very confident that we could make West 11th work through that kind of process. That said, the other options for that segment of West 11th are the use of transportation system management techniques, so queue jumping and transit signal priority and things like that that would help us move through there more quickly, but generally in mixed traffic. And then, of course, there's no build, which again is essentially mixed traffic through that segment. So with that in mind, that information and those findings, if you will, our recommendations are as follows. The no-build and transportation system management options would be kept on the table as we move forward. For the West 6th, 7th Avenues between downtown Eugene and then West 11th Avenue via Garfield, so that's 6th, 7th to 11th. And this one has 4 design options, again, Lincoln-Charlton couplet or a two-way bus lane on Charlton, as I described earlier, adding an existing lane on 6th and 7th Streets, or reassigning a lane on portions of 6th and 7th Streets. I can tell you, our modelers have been hard at work cranking things out. We have some information that we just got late last week that suggests that reassigning a lane on 6th and 7th may be problematic just from a traffic operations standpoint. And again, recall that that's an ODOT facility there, and they'll be looking at what our project does to the flow of traffic there. It's a freight facility and all. But all that stuff will be put together in the alternatives analysis report and will be the basis for a decision. Also recommending keeping 13th Avenue between downtown and 11th Avenue via Chambers Street. And then the other would be from Garfield west to the Commerce Terminus on West 11th. So, as Mike indicated, tonight the Board of Directors is going to make a formal approval of the reduced set of alternatives, and then based on that, we'll complete a draft alternatives analysis report on the reduced set of alternatives. That's something that needs to be reviewed by the Federal Transit Administration, but we expect to get it to them next month. They'll take, I think they said 45 days to review it. Once it's back, we'll go through the same process that we've been talking about in terms of selection of the locally preferred alternative. There'll be a lot of public workshops, public hearings where various bodies find that useful. And then we'll still convene the joint LPA committee to develop a recommendation back to the deciding bodies, which is this council, the MPC, and the LTD board. And we hope to do that by the end of this calendar year. Obviously, it could leak into next calendar year as well. And I believe that is it.
One of the things that might be helpful, Tom, is there are several major points here where we're talking about taking some options off the table. If you could go over the big ones and how that reduces the total from 58 down to a smaller number.
Right, and we're at 10. We're down to 10 now.
Yeah, that's how we're counting it, but yeah.
Okay, you recall that chart that had 58 on there. By removing the full-length alternative, and recall that there were 2 full-length alternatives, one out to Edcone, one out to Willow Creek. With all, that takes about half of the alternatives off just from the pure mathematics of it all. By taking the Seneca terminus off, we remove another third of the alternatives. So again, like I said, with everything else on the table, there was like 16, 17. By taking the Amazon in 7th place off, we get down to 10 alternatives. And that, again, always includes no build and the transportation system management options.
Thank you. Lights on? Good. You want me on the queue? And do you want the queue? So I'll just start out this conversation by saying I think it's smart to narrow it down. 58's a bit too many to keep going with, and would take too long and too expensive to keep drilling down on. So I think that's a good idea on the having read the material and looking at the number, how people sort of voted on comments on it, I'm still of the mind that maybe I would like to spend some more time on 7th Place as a possibility, at least learn more about it and examine that one more. I don't know how the rest of the folks around here feel, but I feel that way. And I also wanted to suggest that maybe this is a place where the folks who are involved in the West Eugene Collaborative might be helpful in maybe hosting a meeting of business folks out in that area. There's a lot of people who participated on that collaborative who have relationships and contacts with some folks out there that might be helpful in that discussion. So just wanted to put that out there as an idea, and would be glad to help try to make that happen if that's something that you all are interested in doing. I just think it might further the conversation. Right. Okay, I've got Mike, and then Betty, and then Alan, and then Chris.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor touched on my initial concern, too, which was delineating the 7th Place alternative. The first reason I saw listed was that you projected a lower ridership for it to be on 7th Place. Is the predominant reason for doing so? Or were those reasons weighted in any way?
We didn't weight them. That was one of the reasons. I would say that was the most compelling reason was the travel time. It's longer than no build, so why would you do it?
Well, I would say that in answer to that, my concerns around the piece of 11th between Garfield and considerably west there, depending on where you draw the end, are the impacts to businesses, one, that are existing there. Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with a number of those folks, a number of those businesses that, and I appreciate certainly your work to talk about how do we mitigate some of those issues on a site-by-site basis. I think that's a real wise approach. But I wonder how much of that can be done in some of those cases where if you're taking an extra lane or an easement of any nature, you're taking out their front parking in a way that can have a detrimental impact to the business. If you're not doing that, if you're not taking out an easement off the front of their property, I think there may be some issues with the construction of West 11th. And there's also been on that West 11th piece issue of several buildings that come within a very close proximity to the street. So there isn't the capacity to widen it. So in essence, to put the bus in that area, you'll be creating more of a bottleneck. I know these are things you've studied in depth, but I'm really, I suppose, speaking more for those who are watching the proceedings. I would hope that we'd have the capacity to study something that travels nearby or relatively nearby and doesn't create what my limited education about this sees as more harmful effects. So with the mayor, I would urge you not to take the 7th Place alternative off the table just yet until there's a further opportunity to engage more people in that process. Thanks.
Betty?
Okay, I agree with Mike on that last point, partially. Questions? I just have a couple of questions. I did say that. Do 6th and 7th still belong to the state? I thought they turned those over to the city.
East of Jefferson is the city's jurisdiction. West of Jefferson
It's still the
is the
state?
state. That becomes more formally Highway 99.
Okay, so that's, east of Jefferson doesn't do you much good then, I guess. I still think that this should go out 99, but that was voted down a long time ago. When you say locally preferred alternative, who preferred by what local people? The businesses or the people on 11th or who?
Well, again, the
They're looking for a
decision-making
local.
process is that the council, the LTD board, and MPC would
Yeah.
make the formal decision.
I understand that, but when you talk about locally preferred alternative,
Right.
what local?
Well,
Locals
it's
have a
us
preference.
collectively.
It isn't the
figuring it out.
people that are local to the route then.
Well, it's the community.
You're not talking about the people on 11.
It's a federal term, so it's local relative to Washington, D.C.
Okay, that's, got it. I thought, what I'm getting from the local people who live and work and have businesses on that thing is that the preferred alternative seems to be no build, from what I'm hearing in large amounts of email, so that's why I had that question. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Alan?
I also share the concern about taking seventh place off the table prematurely. Might be a smart idea to keep that on the table. The rest of it, I think, I agree with the mayor, it's smart to narrow this down at this point, and you've got good rationale for taking these different pieces off the table at this point, and I agree with them. One of my experiences with MX on the current corridor along Franklin, which goes through most of my ward, is that it works a lot better when there's a dedicated lane, and especially one that doesn't zigzag. So if we go down the West 11th corridor, how much of that's going to be dedicated lane?
Well, the design that we have right now would add a lane in each direction. Again, this is a traversable lane. It doesn't affect access to properties. It allows right turns into properties. It allows right turns at intersections. It does a couple of other things for the flow of traffic in that segment.
This is the dedicated lane.
This is the dedicated.
But it doesn't have a hard curb. That's what he means by traversable.
Right. It pulls the.
Easy term.
It probably is. I'll blame it on them anyway. Pulls the buses out of the through travel lanes. Right now we have buses running down West 11th in the shared with the through traffic, and it also pulls the right turners out of the through traffic. So again, our traffic engineering work isn't complete yet, but we actually expect that we'll be able to. I won't promise improvement, but we're not going to make it worse.
So that all the way from Garfield out to Commerce?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And I think MX has been a spectacular success in the part that goes through town right now, from Springfield Station to Eugene Station. Exceeded ridership, your 20-year projection of ridership in the first year, and I ride it often, and it's a very good system. And I think that as time goes by and we become more dense, these systems become even more valuable, and getting people off out of their cars, off the streets, and into transit. And this next corridor is going to be even more important because it starts and as traffic is going to get worse in that corridor. I think this option creates a significant alternative, and I sure as heck hope we can not go down the road of the no-build alternative. I think that would be the worst thing that could happen. And so working down through this, I hope we can navigate our way through getting there on this.
Yes.
And I'd point out a couple things, Counselor. I think our intent is always, as I said, back to the scales, trying to balance the need for our operations, which, the rapid and bus rapid transit is most effective when it can actually be rapid on the street, which means exclusive right-of-way. But you can look at the first two lines. We're virtually complete in construction of the second line. There are stretches along those lines where we're running in mixed traffic, anticipating perhaps some change, or along Gateway eventually we might get to exclusive lanes there, but it's a constrained piece. And the beauty of bus rapid transit is that it is flexible in working with the state of the community as we find it today. That said, we've certainly taken to heart your premise that in the future the exclusive right-of-way is going to be very important.
Yeah, I was just looking at Google Maps and going down West 11th on a more detailed view, and there are a couple of places where we have built buildings out to the street, which create some problems. I suppose have we yet identified where those problem spots are in terms of buildings being in the way? And
Oh, yeah.
how many are there?
Well, actually, we have this, on this data summary, we've got potential property acquisitions, and again, partial versus full. So if you look, well, these are by kind of full, from the station out to Commerce. And a lot of these are what I would call, strips of property along the 5 or 6 miles, whatever that distance is.
So this column that says potential property acquisitions.
Right.
What's partial and full mean? Partial acquisition of
Partial
full.
would be, again, a strip of property, whereas a full would be, our determination that the impact that we're having makes the business unviable, and so we're then required to purchase or acquire the entire.
Yeah. I'm willing to look at all these options and have an open mind about that. But I really think that moving MX forward is an important thing to have happen.
Chris?
Thank you. There's a lot of issues that are important here, and I think hopefully that the LTD board, when they hear Betty and Mike agreeing on something, it's probably something to be very conscious of.
At least acknowledge.
Or not.
At least acknowledge. At least acknowledge.
And the mayor and Alan agree with that, too.
Yeah.
Go ahead and put that on.
Now, with that said, having been on the corridor study committee, I'll say my opinion right up front is that I would agree that right now, today, West 7th is not viable, and it's not viable because it's traveling through the middle of an industrial zone. There's no riders in that area, and your own information shows that. And that if you want to go where the riders are, that's not West 7th. Now, with that said, I would also agree, I think with you at 8 to 10% level of design, it wouldn't hurt to leave it on at least for a while longer and give it another chance to see if it could work or not. You could take it off later. I do want to celebrate, though, that there's many options that are coming off the table. Removing Amazon, changing a whole lot of these other things. There's 58 options because you were trying to be responsive to all the different possibilities. But we've eventually got to boil it down, and I think getting Amazon off of there is a great accomplishment. I think that's a good thing. I think leaving 7th on for at least a while longer, even though I don't necessarily think it's viable, but you want to give it a fair shot, particularly as you move a little further down the design phase, it's reasonable. But the question that I keep hearing is, do we need it in the first place? I mean, maybe we need to go back to Transportation 101 and say, do we need public transit? Yes, we do. Do we need MX as opposed to local corridor service? That's part of the argument that's being offered. And based on the information you've provided us before, local corridor service is getting more and more expensive and getting more and more difficult. You're already cutting back routes because that's expensive. MX is a way to provide an alternative to the kind of corridor service you're providing now in a way that you can afford to do it and will still get people there in a quick and efficient way. So you don't think of MX as being an add-on to corridor service. It will ultimately become a replacement for corridor service. So if you're going to put it on West 7th and eventually remove corridor service on 11th, you really haven't helped anybody there. So I think from a public transit standpoint, you really want to put the buses where the people are going to be, not only now, but in the future as well, which is what I'm thinking about. So it becomes then really a balance of how can you do it. And so for me, as I've said before, and some of the others have pointed out, you don't want to do it in a way that's going to disrupt where things are right now. I think what you need to work towards and what you're already beginning to recognize is the ability to provide MX service in a way that works without having to widen streets, condemn buildings, put in a lot of infrastructure, because I think the fear right now is that infrastructure is going to make it difficult, and I think you can do it without it.
Thank you. George Brown?
Thank you. got a few questions about this chart here, first of all, and I just don't understand some things, I guess. Over here on the annual ridership, I'm looking at the first line, the no-build alternative. Then corridor ridership without downtown. Are these the current figures here? What's happening now, or I mean the last time you did a count?
No, these are this is 2031 forecast.
That's the 2150, okay.
It's a 20-year forecast, basically.
Forecast, okay. 2031?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
It's the 20-year planning horizon.
Yeah. Well, I'm still not totally convinced that the no-build alternative wouldn't be the way to go here. I mean, I look at this and I see that if we, let's just say we go down 6th and 7th and then to 11th to Commerce, and that's going to cost from $105 to $113 million. That's in today. I mean, this is before the inevitable inflation and cost overruns and everything. And I assume that 10% of that has to be the local match. And
Actually, it's more like anywhere from 20 to 40%. But that's
Okay.
why we're going to the legislature with
and some from the
our
state, but
request.
then some will inevitably have to come from the city. No? You think
No,
they
that-
can get it all from the state?
Our intent, and again, the model that TriMet's provided is that that's
I see.
entirely possible.
I hope the state would be able to provide that. I can barely provide for many things.
They did to Portland.
And all of this to save 3 seconds. I mean, 3 minutes from downtown to the Commerce Terminal. I don't know, it's a lot of money for, say, 3 minutes. But anyway, and I just want to echo what my fellow councilors have said so far about the 7th place. I know, it seems like that one you could just, that's a no-brainer, just scratch it off. And yet, it is an area that is partially developed that could kind of, fit into the scheme of transit-oriented developments. Like, if we ran something there, people are already doing things, maybe it would fill in with, the Courage film, that's part of it. Transit-oriented development. But you're right, if you run it down 11th, then that's where all the businesses are, that's where the jobs are.
The activity is there.
Not a lot of dwellings, but... And I would also like, I read we had an email from Alona Colazar, she's on the 3, he's on one of the groups here, citizens groups, and I think it would be a good idea to put Pearl and Oak back on into the mix downtown, because if we go down Lincoln and or Charlton, we could lose around 80 parking spaces downtown. And I think that's an important, we don't have any plans to replace them. And so
Thanks, George.
I'll need another round.
Okay. Now, I just want to tell you that we have a whole other work session here, and we're heading into quarter 2, so we're going to have to, I've got one more in the first round and 4 signed up for the second round, and that's going to take so I'm just, make it as short as you can, and let's move. So, Jennifer.
Sure. Tom, thank you for this. They're really helpful. My questions, just as usual, focus on the property acquisition. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to know if your estimated cost for the total project includes what you think you might have to pay for acquisitions.
Yes.
Really?
I'm sorry, it does.
It
Yes.
does. Includes it.
And then, in the cases where you might have to initiate condemnation, are you guys allowed to do that, LTD?
Yes.
Even though you're not an elected board?
It's something we have.
Frankly, I don't want the responsibility of condemnation, but that is a little disturbing that a non-elected board can initiate condemnation. But, okay, those were my questions for now.
Okay. I want to dash through some things really fast. One of the things I think about, even though I want to keep 7th place as an option, I still have to think and I haven't heard it brought up, that 11th, not only in terms of people and jobs, that's where it's close to the existing neighborhoods. Those are the connections to all those streets and neighborhoods that are right on the other side of that. And the further you move away from that, the less easy it is for them to make use of this system. So I just want to bring that up. I want to remind people of the Max experience in Portland, where people went ballistic over it and fought it a lot of the way, and now they vie for who gets the next. It's been proven to be good to business and good for folks to mobility. So it's a very similar kind of thing, and so I just wanted to bring that up. And the only other thing I wanted to just throw into at some point in the future, I'm hoping that we will have the capacity to think about sort of the rail connection out that end to what we're already providing close in. So trying to envision our future. And the other thing is, although we are dealing with today, we are trying to look out into tomorrow. And so we've got to do things today that prepare us for tomorrow. Just dealing with today won't get us very far in the long run. So really have to think both ways. Chris, and then Mike, and then Alan, and then George, and really, really fast.
Just really quickly, what I want to try to avoid here is having this become a conflict between public benefit and business benefit, because I don't want that to become this artificial conflict that occurs. So I think balancing things is going to be the ideal. And so I just encourage LTD as it explores the West 11th alternative, that it really focus on doing it in a way that doesn't require a lot of infrastructure. I think there's a lot of fear on West 11th that infrastructure is going to create disruptions. I mean, and I've seen some of the flyers that are going around, and they're just absolutely insane in terms of the dire predictions they're saying. But I do think somewhere in that fear is the concern that if you build a level of infrastructure you put on other corridors, it could be disruptive. I want to believe that you can provide West 11 MX service without having to put in a whole bunch of infrastructure that's going to disrupt business. I think that is possible to do, and I would encourage you to look at that as you explore that corridor.
Thank you for that, Mike.
I neglected to say that I would as well be interested further in hearing about the no-build option in terms of its impacts on people. I have at least some degree of interest in that, not just because of its impacts on business in the area, but because, and I don't mean to tell the LTD board how to run their organization, but I still am not convinced that it's wise to do this level of capital investment when the operations the operations funding is in such difficult position. I understand that those federal funding and potentially state funding streams are very different, but I'd be interested to know and get the education that Chris seemed to put forward, that it would in fact create an operating budget that was smaller than current operating budget. I'd welcome that education. But lastly, in the current economic environment where both the federal and the state governments are having some challenges, I assume that even though we're not yet through the NEPA process, the federal funding, how far along are you in acquisition and approval of that funding? I know we have some help in that regard, but I would assume that's at a different place than the state funding?
Yes, it's a different process.
I know it's a different process, but I mean, what level of the process are you currently through with regard to approval? How sure a thing is it?
Well, we have yet to begin the actual grant application process, but that's all part of the overall process. We have to go through this piece before FTA will even consider a grant application. So that's the focus now, is getting to the point of a locally preferred alternative that we can take into a process that allows us to apply for the grant.
And to back on something that someone else said, for example, the federal funding becomes difficult, the state funding becomes difficult. If either one of those do, it's not going to then become something we're going to look to fund locally. Is that correct? We don't build option at that point?
We don't have the ability to impose this on the community, and we have no desire to do that. I mean, we're doing this in collaboration with the city and the MPO, and so that is not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
Alan?
So some of the stuff that's been flying around, I think we're in an era of hyperbole, and some of it's just outrageous. I mean, if you go harken back to the healthcare debate, the world was supposed to have ended, yet here we are. The goal needs to be that it get completely funded by the feds and the state. The other point I'd like to make is that history shows that these transit projects are good for business. They actually enhance the businesses that are along the routes. I mean, Portland's a great example of that.
That's right.
And I think MX is starting to be that and will continue to be that. And we need to focus that this is a 30, 40, 50-year decision,
Exactly.
not a decision for tomorrow. So that's the decision we're talking about, the congestion in West Eugene corridor, the traffic and the greenhouse gas impacts of more traffic in a congested atmosphere where transit can really take a significant whack out of that. And then finally, I harken back to something that MPC and Springfield Councilor Hillary Wiley always says, this is not enough that we provide the alternatives. They need to make it so that it's convenient and easy for people to do. And the fact that MX is so successful is because it is convenient and easy. It comes every 10 minutes. You don't have to think about it. The stations are there. The connections to other modes are there. So it is easy and convenient. And that's what I think the hallmark of MX will be out in West Eugene corridor as well.
George?
My question is already answered. Thank you.
Mike?
I just wanted to sort of summarize what I've heard so that you'll know what my impression is and what I'll be taking back to the rest of the board. I'd like to acknowledge that fellow board member Gary Gillespie is here, so he's heard it in person also. I've heard you say you appreciate the fact that we're winnowing this down. You want us to take the low-hanging fruit, but you don't want us to cut something that might be viable. So you'd like us to keep the West 7th on the table for now at least. And then the other thing is that I know that this city is committed to reducing greenhouse gases, reducing congestion, reducing reliance on fossil fuel, and I think we've demonstrated that MX does those things. It moves a lot of people very cost effectively, and it does promote business along the way. I think that speaks for itself.
Thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate it. And I guess we'll have to move on. Thank you so much. We're going to head into this work session on the Civilian Review Board annual report presentation. And before we do that, I just want all of you to know that I have to be up in Salem in an hour. And so I'm going to stay for a while, but if you see me get up and leave and hand it over to Mike, you'll know why. Okay? Mark? Kate?
Hello.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you.
Just please make you're welcome, and please begin your report.
Well, hopefully you all have the report in front of you. We tried to keep it fairly short and hopefully readable. I guess the things I'd like to call your attention to and answer any questions about today are the recommendations that we made. And this is directly out of our experience over the last 2 years, and this would start at page 3. The one suggestion we had was perhaps it would be time for a review, an ordinance review type of committee. That's just one option, but we just wanted to raise those issues for your attention. I have other board members here with me today as well, and if any of them want to chime in, I'd ask them to do that.
Welcome to the other members of the CRB, and I just want to express on behalf of all of us our appreciation for the hard work that you guys put in and what you do on behalf of our community. So thank you very much. And I also wanted to say to you that I appreciated under your police auditor assessment and recommendations, the quote here is that the board has concluded that the auditor has provided strong support to the board. Mr. Gisner has established a good working relationship with Eugene Police while maintaining the necessary independence. He has a professional and diplomatic manner, which is appreciated. He meets or exceeds expectations in all core areas. I appreciate hearing that. Makes me feel like we're making progress. So thank you very much for that. And for my part, I understand when you're asking for perhaps a review of the ordinance, it's the part of the ordinance that has to do with the CRB that you were asking for a review of, and do you want to go into that in a little more detail for us?
Sure, I can do that. I don't know that it's necessarily just the CRB sections. It might impact other sections of the ordinance as well. But the four areas that we pointed out, and again, this is based on our experience as a board on issues that have actually come up. This isn't just things we thought of. Community impact case designation under the ordinance, as it's currently written, only the auditor can classify a case as a community impact case, which then affects the various options that the board can do and the timeliness of how those are handled. It's been expressed to the board at various meetings and by different members of the public that perhaps the board should have a role in that decision as well, either in addition to the auditor, or maybe the board should be making that decision. We've discussed it as a board, and I think there's not a real consensus either way on whether we should or we shouldn't, but we wanted to raise that concern. I don't know that the way we're set up, how practical it would be in some ways if we were to make that determination. I mean, we could clearly do it, but that would also be something that would have to be thought about because of different issues with the timeliness. In terms of information and disclosure, I think you all got the attachments as well. Our goal is to provide as much information to the public, and this came out of the community impact case discussion with the first community impact case that we reviewed at the library, where we heard over and over again, I think audience members felt that they didn't have access to information. I mean, they couldn't look at the IA report. They couldn't look at, different things. And we'd like to provide as much information as possible, but we need to obviously stay within the bounds of Oregon, open records laws and personnel laws, that type of thing. So some direction on that would be helpful. And then in terms of the next bullet point is the CRB authority to order cases to be reopened. And this came up in the Chinese student case. And some of you might recall, a majority of the board did vote to order the city to reopen the investigation. I guess that sparked a legal opinion from the city's attorney that we did not have that authority. The charter says that the city council is going to give the board the authority to require the city to reopen investigations. And then in the ordinance itself, it talks about that power only in regard to community impact cases. The city attorney's opinion was then that power is limited to community impact cases. And I'm sure you've all seen Mr. Klein's memo on that. It's an area where at least some of the board felt like there is confusion there, or just, I guess, a lack of direction in terms of closed cases when we do a case review of that type of case, if we have the authority to order the city to do that. I mean, at that point, the IA investigation is closed, and so I don't know what issues that may create in terms of personnel issues, because, you'd be going back and maybe reopening a disciplinary matter that had been closed, and I don't know if that runs afoul of some other problem. But again, that's just an issue that came up directly from that case. We wanted to raise it for you. The last thing was something that came up recently, and that is in the ordinance, there's a 6-month filing deadline for complaints generally. And recently there was a complainant who tried to file beyond that date, and the ordinance says, per good cause, the auditor can make an exception. There's no definition of good cause, and I think we had varying interpretations of what that phrase may or may not mean. But in our view, in some cases, to narrow the discretion of the auditor, of the office of the auditor, is probably a good thing in terms of transparency and that everyone's kind of following the same policies and procedures in all cases. And that was our concern with that last one, that it potentially opens the auditor's office to claims that in some cases you may override that and find good cause, in other cases you wouldn't, and are you using the same criteria all the time? So again, just wanted to raise that issue.
Thank you. Mike, you're first up with questions, and actually, I'm going to excuse myself to head up for the real meeting in Salem, and you're going to take over. Okay? All right.
Do my best. I'll move over here and then get to my questions.
All right.
Oh, that was good.
Oh.
Short here, that would be best. Thanks, sir. Okay. Thanks, Kate. One of the things well, first of all, I want to say that I appreciate very much the work that all the volunteer members do. It's quite a commitment. It's greatly appreciated. Betty and I have the unique opportunity to talk about some of these issues with the auditor on a regular basis as we get to be his immediate review and supervisors by virtue of the president and vice president rule. One of the things you mentioned just a moment ago was that at least some of the board members felt a certain way. And I was wondering, this report was prepared by you and the vice chair, is that correct?
Yes.
Did the rest of the board vote on this report before submitting it?
The report was circulated in draft form to all the board members. Response back from several of them with changes. Those were incorporated. It was sent around again. We did not have a formal vote on it, but my recall of the emails is that everyone was in general agreement with the report and that it represented the position of the board. I mean, we have several board members here if you'd like to direct that question.
The only reason I ask that question is because in some of the conversations I get the opportunity to sit with Mark and to have some very detailed conversations about some of these pieces, and I at least got the sense that there were times when certain board members felt one way and certain board members felt a different way about some of these issues, and that it wasn't necessarily a consensus piece, so I kind of wanted to get a better feeling for that.
Well, I can tell you after this was circulated in virtually the same report, I did not get a response from any board member saying, I absolutely don't agree, or, you have this piece wrong, and I don't know if that was communicated somewhere else, but, I didn't hear a clear objection to anyone saying this report does not speak for me.
Mm-hmm. There were a number of pieces in it that the wording was interesting to me, but I, again, appreciate this information. I guess lastly, with the recommendation that we form another pay or review committee of some nature, I would like to have the auditor's comments on that recommendation as well as the auditor's comments on the rest of the report, if we could, as well.
I think when we talked about it, I didn't know the answer to your question, so then I sent that to Kate and the other board members just to make sure that they clarified with her. I believe it represents the consensus of the board. Again, at that point in time, I did not know the answer to that. The issues certainly are enlightening in terms of some of the recommendations. The community impact case designation, I believe that was a legislative decision. I can't really quibble with that, but I appreciate the board. One of the things I think that's important in this dynamic is, and Kate's been around a lot longer, and certainly Tim Lowy has worked council, police commission, all the other commissions basically involving police. But beyond that, we have a board that is new. Snell Fondness is the second most senior member, and he came on in February of 2009. Mm-hmm. We had two more that came on in July of 2009, and then the rest came on in October of 2009. I'd be hesitant at this point in time to sort of ask for those major changes until we get into a more comfort zone in terms of their experience on the board, but again, that's not my decision to make. I think in terms of the information and disclosure, we are pushing out more information each and every meeting to try to get out as much information as possible to the public, but being consistent with the public records law of the state of Oregon. I've had conversations with the Attorney General, and I know that at some point in time in the future that he is going to make legislative recommendations with regard to the Oregon Public Records Law, but I don't know when that is going to occur.
I'd like to jump in there if I could, because in this particular report, about the fourth, fifth line down, it says, because of the uncertainty surrounding the legal requirements of confidentiality. Maybe you could help me understand what's uncertain about it? I thought our attorney issued an opinion on that.
And I didn't bring all the memos. There is, not an exception, but there's a part of one of the statutes that's talking about personnel records that talks about the records being disclosed if it's in the public interest. And as far as we could tell, there's no definition and I looked through the AG's 200-page manual on public records of who gets to define that public interest or what it is, essentially. And
has our attorney issued an opinion on that?
I don't believe he has on that specific point, and that was specifically, I believe, what we asked the AG, because arguably under that definition, the CRB could say it's in the public interest to release X.
If I may not paraphrase.
I think Glenn wanted to, and I'm sorry to interrupt you mid-sentence, sir. I think Glenn wanted to add something to that as well.
There aren't any cases yet that really define what, quote, is in the public interest for purposes of that statute. In terms of who gets to make the determination as to whether something's in the public interest, that is not a state law question. That's a city charter or city code question. And what I have said is, particularly with respect to any of the IA files, that's the city manager, or really through him, the police chief, that gets to make that call. It is not the police auditor, is not the CRB. It's not me. I can give legal advice, but ultimately it's, is it in the public interest? The city gets to make that call in the first instance, but ultimately if somebody disagrees with that, that individual has the right under the Oregon Public Records Act to challenge that determination. When we refuse to turn over a document under the Public Records Act, the person has the right to petition the district attorney and say, I think the city improperly is withholding that public record. It's happened. It's been in the paper. The Register Guard has done it. Others have done it. The district attorney at that point has the ability to say, I disagree, city. The document should be disclosed. Or the district attorney can agree with the city. Either way, that then could get appealed up to circuit court. So people do have an ability to have that issue reviewed. It's not the city's final determination, but with respect to the city organization itself, I have advised that it is not the auditor's call or the CRB's call. When we're talking about IA files, it is the city manager or the police chief's call.
So the uncertainty that's listed here isn't really around the issue of confidentiality. It's around the manager or the police chief's call over what's in the public interest. Is that correct?
I believe that's right. I think there may have been another issue we asked the AG to comment on, similar type of thing, but I can't recall it right now. But I believe that's what it would be discussing, those two things.
Okay, thank you, Mark. You were commenting on these, and the PAYORK one is really the one I was hoping you would get to, about your comments on whether we should reconstitute some sort of review committee of some nature.
Well, first, in terms of my conversation with the Attorney General on the public records, is he himself said there's no legislative definition of public interest. He believes, I think, that there should be a legislative definition within the state of Oregon. Ultimately, on state records, it comes to his desk because he's forced to make that decision, just as the district attorney may be forced to make that decision as well. In terms of the issue about reopening the cases, and I think the other issue, a good cause as well. Some of these are sort of wrapped into collective bargaining agreements as well, so I would default to the attorneys for those groups to hammer out whether or not it's related to collective bargaining agreements and whether one supersedes the other. I don't think there's a case in Oregon in which there's been a decision made that a collective bargaining agreement overrides an ordinance or a charter locally, or vice versa. I'm not aware of it anyway, but it may in fact exist. On the last issue, in terms of rather reopening the issues about the Civilian Review Board, I can certainly see the case being made before that. Again, though, I go back to that same issue of each of these board members, I think their terms, other than Snell, perhaps expires in 2011. They go to 2013. I would, my personal opinion is that maybe we should wait a little while longer until they get more experience and some training on these things before that is created. But I certainly appreciate, now that we're in their, if you will, the second generation of the Civilian Review Board, how they may have some issues in terms of the ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess I would say, just with my last few seconds, that I thought that having sat through one or two of the sessions, I thought that the Payork Committee did a wonderful job in the review of this and a fairly detailed bit of work. I've been happy so far with the way I've seen the revised ordinance in operation. I think that folks have done a wonderful job, and I was happy to see the committee expanded to 7. But I, too, I suppose, would share the feeling that it may be premature to form some sort of review or reopen this for now, but maybe at some future point. Alan?
I, too, I need to leave 5 minutes early, so if we're not done by then, I'll excuse myself. Kate, thank you for the work that you've done, especially doing a good job as chair, and likewise to Tim as co-chair, and the rest of the group, the CRB, for all the hard work you do and the hours that you put in. It's very much appreciated by me and the council, I think, and the community. I think that eventually we want to do another ordinance review. But it seems like we just did that.
Yeah.
And having sat on the Payork, it seems like it was just yesterday, but it seems like just yesterday I was elected, but that was almost 4 years ago. So I think we need to compile these issues, and this is exactly the type of issues I think we should compile, and for future review in another run at that committee. But I think we need a little bit more time under our belt under the current changes that came out of Payork, and get a little bit more seasoned CRB, and kind of let things sit for a while, and then go back and look at them and compile them. And I think these types of reports are exactly the type of place where we can go back to them and pull them out very nicely. As far as the public records law, I think that if you guys have some very specific ideas for changes, that you could forward them to the council and via the IGR to have as a discussion and potential action to present as a legislative priority for the city, like the definition of a public interest. That one strikes me as particularly interesting, and peculiarly that it's that there is no definition of public interest. So it's whatever anybody wants to say it is in the particular instance. So those types of things I think would be valuable to work through our process to potentially go to the legislature in the next session. I hope that no one's of the opinion that a collective bargaining agreement trumps a city council ordinance. That would be pretty odd to me. I'd like to see an instance where that was shown to be the case. And the last two issues, the reopening and the good cause, we purposefully created, and I wasn't involved in the initial creation of the auditor's office, but we purposefully created a semi-strong auditor's position, especially as it pertains to the Civilian Review Board, so that a lot of the authority vests with the auditor, and that the Civilian Review Board is the advisory body to that, and also has certain powers that it's granted in the ordinance. I'm not sure I, at this point, want to change that very dramatically. I think it's still a good pathway to have that be a strong auditor.
Would you like another round, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe.
Chris?
Thank you. Really good work. I'm impressed with the work that the CRB has done. It's always nice when you have a group that takes their job very seriously. they don't just go to the meetings and kind of go through the motions and then go home. This is a group that's very caught up in what it's doing and has really good questions and is asking good questions and things that need to be worked on. I would agree we probably want to be a little more deliberate in terms of getting there. And it's not a reflection on the CRB not being a good group or a competent group, but once again, I think experience and just getting some seat time is maybe the best way to put it. With that said, though, I do think we don't want to leave these go. We do want to deal with them, and we want to deal with them in an effective way. I've been pleased with where the entire audit function has gone over these last 4 years. I think that we may not have moved as quickly as some folks would have liked us to go, and we may not have gone in a direction that some folks would have liked us to go, but I think we've done a really admirable job of staying on what I think is the right course, which is to do this thoughtfully, deliberatively, and collaboratively. I mean, you could try to steamroll in either direction and not really get where you want to get to. So I think this goes as far as it needs to go in the right way and ask the right questions, and I do want to work with them. But I think I agree with most of the comments that I've heard. We just do it in that, and we continue to be that thoughtful, deliberate way. And I see the relationship between the council and the CRB and the auditor to be one that has many more strengths than it has weaknesses. And I would want that to also extend between the relationship between the CRB, the auditor, and the police department and the staff to also ensure that it maintains that collaboration as much as possible. I do not see that as a weakness. I see that as a strength in the audit process.
Anyone else in the first round? Alan. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
I've just come on the point I made about the collective bargaining agreement is because we went through that whole issue in Ohio and in Cincinnati, where it ended up going all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court about 5 years after the whole issue was initiated. So my point being that perhaps we should take a look at it at the front end administratively rather than being pushed into a court situation where we might not get resolution for several years. I don't know if Oregon works as fast in the courts as Ohio works as slow, but just that's the point that I think I was trying to make.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. I'm going to let Betty, because she hasn't had a first round here, and she just jumped in.
I just jumped in, yes. Thank you. First, I agree that we should wait a while if there's another committee. I think the CRB is, as I've said to Mark before, that the membership is so new that they haven't had it. And I disagree with Mike. I think we made it too large. I think it should be 5 people at the most. 3 to 5 is a good working group. And so it will take longer for it to become a group because it's larger, I think. And if we do need another committee, possibly the CRB might serve as the committee, since they're the ones that have been working with it. And I wondered if I would be interested in knowing whether I think we should discuss whether the CRB could override the auditor in some cases. For example, whether something's a good cause, and about reopening cases. I think those are things we should discuss as a council, actually, with advice from CRB.
Thank you, Betty.
And I guess that's it. Thanks.
Sorry, I thought you were done there. I apologize.
I was thinking, but I'm done.
Okay. It's very interesting.
This is Board Member Steve McIntyre.
Steve, hi. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I just want to say that as one of the newest members, I came on in November of 2009. The issues that are raised here, I do not really believe they're experience related. I think that there are some ambiguities that the CRB is seeking to have clarified by the council, which actually would make our jobs more effective and efficient and would provide clarity and direction. So I think that I would hope and ask that the council review the request in that lens versus a new board. I think the board has come together pretty well and is pretty cohesive, has great discussions, encourage you to come join us sometime, but I think that these issues are not really experience related. I guess that would be my comment.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, George, go ahead.
Can I make just a quick follow-up? I mean, our suggestion on a potential, the idea of another committee, I mean, that's just one idea. I mean, if the council wants to meet and tell us, hey, you don't have authority to do this, and there's not going to be any forthcoming definition of good cause, I mean, that's fine. But, I think these are issues that may come up again, and as Steve said, we're going to be in the same position of saying, well, we don't know, do we have authority to do that? Or, So the committee idea was just one idea. So we're not bound to that at all. And I don't know if we can make that determination on our own. I mean, like, when we see a discrepancy or a disconnect between charter and ordinance language, I don't know that the CRB has the authority to say, I mean, I guess we kind of did when we said we think we have the authority to do this. But then we're told, by the city attorney, we don't. I think at that point, we're kind of stuck with that, and that's fine. But again, we just want to raise that issue for you so that if these come up again and we're criticized or you're criticized, that you had a chance to see that issue and at least know it's out there.
I guess I would, sitting in the chair, I guess I get the authority to respond there a little, and I'll say that I agree with Alan, and Ed should make note of that as well. I think we set the system up intentionally to have a strong auditor, and I think that's a good idea. I'm happy that we've done that. From my perspective, I don't see any ambiguity in the current construction of the auditor's capacity to determine what's good cause. And so, I mean, from my perspective, I wouldn't change that. I think that's just how we'd want it to be. But I can appreciate how, when there's a disagreement between some members of the CRB and or the auditor or amongst the CRB, that may be one way to deal with it, is to request some sort of new arrangement. That's kind of how I feel on a couple of these personally. But perhaps council will have a chance to speak on some of these suggestions at a future point, or at least have some sort of work session on them.
Make a good point.
Add George, and then I got Alan in the second round.
Well, I would have to agree. Thanks a lot, you guys, by the way. I've attended several of your sessions, the ones that we can attend. It didn't conflict with our regular Monday meetings, and I thought they were really good discussions and very thorough. I think you did a terrific job. I agree with Steve. It's not a. These recommendations are not a matter of their inexperience or just being new. I mean, these are like very intelligent, mature people. Three of them are attorneys, and they're just asking for clarity on these things, so that I imagine similar things will come up all the time. I mean, the information disclosure. Some of that's out of our hands. I think it has to be dealt with by the state legislature. But as it is now, it's kind of like every local jurisdiction kind of gets to decide what can be disclosed and what can't be. And that's, whereas in Ohio, it's a state law for every. My understanding is everything is disclosable except your phone number and your Social Security number. For every public official, including police officers, and so in Oregon, it's just pretty restrictive.
Yeah.
So that's out of our hands initially. I mean, that's kind of a legislative thing, but I think that we should go ahead and try to clarify these other two things. And I'm not exactly sure whether we need another committee. I mean, we made a suggestion of having the CRB come up with some suggestions, research it, because I read Kate's letter to the Attorney General. I just thought it was fabulous and very well researched. And I was really disappointed with the response from the aide. I mean, John didn't even respond as aide did. It's 2 sentences. There's this, 10-page well-researched letter. So that would be my suggestion: is to CRP to get the ball rolling on this, if they have time. I mean, you guys are pretty busy, God knows, but whether in front of home committee. Thank you.
Alan?
So I distinguish definitions and clarifications from structural and authority changes. So some of the stuff that you brought up is in either category. The stuff that should go to another PAYORC type of ordinance review committee would be the stuff that revolved around authority and structural changes in the way we did that. I think that's the stuff we should hold off. I agree that some of these things, like we don't have a definition of what good cause is. That's not a structural or authority thing. I think that's something that the CRB and the police auditor should work through and bring back to the council for clarification, that we create those kind of definitions. So I don't have any problem at all having you bring back that stuff to us. The structural and authority changes, I think, is for a different day. So actually, I would appreciate those kind of clarifications, and as they come up, just bring them to us and say, this is unclear, here's our suggestion about, here's our discussion about it, and here's our suggestion about how to fix it. I think that should be a matter of course for the CRB as this evolves over time. I also appreciate the evaluation you guys did of the police auditor, and I know the mayor read this, but I'll read it again because I think it bears saying twice, that Mr. Gissner has established a good working relationship with the Eugene Police while maintaining the necessary independence. His professional diplomatic manner, which is appreciated, and he meets or exceeds our expectations in all core areas assessed. I think Mark has done an excellent job. My goal in getting a new police auditor was that we keep it off the front page and that we establish a good working and fair oversight function. I think you and the CRB have done that very well, unless, of course, it ends up being on the front page of the paper tomorrow, then you failed.
In a good way.
But in a good way, right?
Mark, you wanted to say, I'm sorry.
One more comment. I appreciate that you guys do a lot of work, but I'm wondering if you guys can't have a discussion about the meeting time that you have, which conflicts with city council. That's not only a city council conflict, but it also, for people who go into the council, can't attend that. So I'm wondering if you can't go back and look at that and see if there's a different day that makes sense for you guys to meet.
Actually, if you look in the report, in December, we did change our meeting, and we're now meeting the second Tuesday of the month.
Okay.
And that is something I know we've been trying to do for a long time, and finally able to do that.
Disregard my last comment.
Words that go to that, or never mind. Mark?
I just wanted to say I agree. I agree with Steve 100% on some of the clarity issues and some of the agreements that were written prior to my arrival. I might have offered some counsel about using words like include, because those do create ambiguities depending on your interpretation. And so I think that is a good idea. I think good cause is defined a little bit more than what's in the text here, but still there's some room for interpretation on that. I also just wanted to comment on the fact that we have a vigorous and hard-working review board. We don't always agree on decisions, but I have to say, for a citizens committee, they make decisions, and they make tough decisions, and they don't belabor the processes. They do their homework before they get there. It's not a brainstorming session. It's a discussion of substantial issues in which everyone's done their homework and they were prepared to have that discussion. So I just really want to offer my commendations to them for the hard work that they do in the preparation. And now that we have a new training schedule, I suppose we're going to need to tap more of their time. But they do. It's a decisive, vigorous group, and I think that was maybe one of the problems before us. People felt disengaged who were members of the CRB, at least some of them. I don't see any of those folks being disengaged in this process.
Okay. With 3 minutes left, Alan?
One more question. The collective bargaining agreements and the protocols and all the rules that were established by your predecessor, some of those, do they come up for review? Do they sunset or that are attached to the collective bargaining so that they become a point of renegotiation?
I think, and I don't have an agreement, I know there's a contract in place. I don't think that there is a time frame for the protocols. And so, again, that's another issue as well, but Glenn might be able to better answer that.
It's a chair right here.
The protocols have become part of the collective bargaining agreement. And so when the collective bargaining agreement comes up for review, renegotiation, that would certainly be an opportunity to say it's time to look at changing some of the protocols. The collective bargaining agreement